Welcome to Running on Ice, the coolest community in freight. I'm your host, Mary O'Connell, bringing you the latest tech updates, warehouse news, and everything happening in the cold chain world. Not only is there the coolest show in freight, but there's also Running on Ice, the newsletter that could not be colder. You can subscribe to that on freightwaves.com/runningonIce. Today, we welcome Carl McDermott, Chief SaaS Officer and General Manager of UBQ Network at DeltaTrack. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carl.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be on your show this afternoon.
I am excited for today because we are getting into one of those really kind of unique and niche solutions that you guys have come up with, and I love getting into solutions because if there's anything that we know is that the supply chain world is full of nothing but problems. So anytime there's a good news to be had, I love to talk about it. Before we get too far into that, though, let's get some background on you and kind of how you got started at DeltaTrack.
Yep. So thank you, Mary, again for the invitation to speak on your show this afternoon. I've been at DeltaTrack for 9 months. I joined in mid-April. Previous to that, I was leading a freight tech organization out of Toronto, Canada. Previous to that, a SaaS TMS company in the cloud. And I was an EVP at a last mile logistics company for a year and a half. So that's kind of my history in supply chain. I did previous to that 10 years of innovation and strategy and enterprise software before that. So anything that enterprise software, innovation, strategy, and now the last 15 years in logistics. And that's my intro to DeltaTrack and what I've been working with the founder there, Fred Wu, on building the UBQ network.
I personally love anyone that comes into the logistics space with a pretty hefty software background because I've said it once, if nobody says it, it's because I'm dead. And that is, it's time to get our supply chains off of Excel. Like if we could just stop running them on Excel, that would be great. Because, there's so many better solutions. So many.
Yeah. And just a quick anecdote. And so I used to do financial planning solutions and budgeting and financial organization, which 25 years ago, pre-ERP, were also running in Excel. I know there was a study in Deloitte and it said 95% of all Excel spreadsheets have undetected errors. And that hasn't been fixed, right? It's just a question of how you build the formulas. Nothing really intrinsic problem with the Excel itself. So if that's how we're planning our supply chain, it's no small wonder then we've had some of these hiccups in the last few years. And I definitely believe there are other ways that we can basically crack that problem.
Yes, pretty much anything that could remove, because that's not even including anyone that just accidentally flips a number when they try to type it in.
No.
And that is my number one guilty sin is I will flip a number like it's going out of style.
Yeah.
But moving into things that don't necessarily result in Excel. So in the cold chain space, there are a lot of problems. We have different regulations for different products, different industries. Obviously, things are going to be different from food and beverage all the way down to pharmaceuticals and, even down to e-commerce. It's all so different and still kind of fragmented, but still each have their own set of regulations. So what are some of the most common industry challenges that you see that you're really ugh, we need a good solution for this?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really good intro because if you boil down what we're trying to do across all those industries, you mentioned several, right? So protein, produce, anything in perishables, anything in the CPG space is, creating or having products that delight the customers. And basically that means there's a lot of movement of goods from one place to another. In the case of produce is the one that we know best at DeltaTrack. It's, you've got producer growers, creating the world's best berries and the world's best avocados. Then they get basically shipped to packing houses, to cooling stations. They get put into the supply chain. They get moved to maybe suppliers or distributors, moved on to receivers like the grocery chains and then the food service outlets, and then handed off to the customers, right? And that, if you like, that industrial supply chain hasn't changed so much in the last few years. Now, what has changed, and I guess this is the why now, is, food wastage is off the charts, right? It's like 30 to 40% of, I mean, all food shipped in the US is food waste. It's $180 billion problem. We really need to start fixing this. The second is, you've got the new rules around traceability. So, and the traceability really talks to the problem of food safety as much as anything else. So FSMA 204, if you go to any of the US forums or the US industry events, FSMA 204 now has been, probably the most talked about subject. And it basically improves the traceability from that producer grower and all the handling points through the supply chain, right? So that's also there and it's coming into law. It's suddenly getting closer than ever. January 2026, literally just around the corner. And that also applies to some of those protein categories like seafood. Um, and finally, I think the other big challenge that we have is sustainability. We were kind of, if you've been the old enough maybe in the last 20 years, you're used to having every single fruit and veg option pretty much all year round, right? And that's because if we're in North America or in Europe, we had the southern hemisphere, it's on the different seasons, it's polar opposite to us, and they're producing goods and putting it in containers and shipping it around the world. And I think now looking at the sustainability angles, so not just like cost and provenance, but also how the product's being moved through the supply chain, and the carbon emission becomes an important equation that we need to factor in as an industry and then educate consumers so they can make informed decisions. So those really are the big three levers that we see, and I think they apply to some of the other categories, but specifically to produce. Food safety, food wastage, and obviously sustainability and carbon emissions.
The food waste is the I will say that food waste is the one that makes me the angriest because we have a lot of tools and we have a lot of resources at our disposal to make it so it maybe can only be look, some of it's inevitable just because things happen, things break, things are improperly stored, whatever. There is some waste, but it doesn't have to be 30%. Like just to get it any lower than that is a huge win from
Yeah.
in my book. But you know, heaven forbid I get what I want sometimes.
Yeah, that's you're totally right. I think it does require like an industry focus to kind of drive out the waste at every single step of the supply chain, right? And the worst case is obviously at the consumer. Once you've got your produce in the fridge, your mixed bag lettuce, your berries or your avos, and they're going off. That's probably the worst case, right? It's the full value and, it's either going to a landfill at that point or some kind of food bank, as long as it's being, safely, processed for human consumption or any other use. So yeah, there's a lot of work needs to be done there to kind of drive out those, activities that create waste.
So kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of the work because it's nice
Yeah.
because it's really easy to say, "Hey, look, we have all these problems and they
Yeah.
suck
Yeah.
and would love to fix them, but
Yeah.
good luck."
Yeah.
But you guys actually have something that you just announced that low key fixes some of it. I'm not
Yeah.
going to say it
Yeah.
fixes everything because, I'm pretty sure it's going to take more than just you guys to get that global food waste down a little bit. But you have a fantastic tool that you recently came out with, and that's kind of this creation of the UBQ network. Do you mind breaking that down and kind of explaining what it is and how it's solving some of these problems we just talked about?
Yep, sure. So, and probably I want to just give a little bit of history as how Delta Track got in this business. So, Delta Track, we're like a pioneer, if you like, of the temperature control. So, the temperature devices, the paper-based loggers, probably in use 35 years ago, they were there to help make sure that produce being shipped was actually within the tolerances set for safe consumption and obviously maximum quality. Um, Obviously, as a company, we've managed like different ways of innovation. So we moved to digital, right, which is the USB thermometers. And 6 years ago, we saw a big opportunity to basically have real time information. So it's using the cell phone network, obviously, that's then reporting temperature and location. And basically, that helped us address some of the big issues in the pandemic, right? Because where's my product? Is it going to arrive on time? And what's the produce quality? Um, what we're seeing in the industry is we're creating lots of data, and it's not just us. It's not just Delta Track and some are UBQ. There's a lot of good software companies out there that are also digitizing processes, you know, at the producer grower in distribution of in the grocery space. And what we see then is an opportunity is to bring those data sets together. And that has been a challenge, not in every industry, but specifically in the produce industry, is because people didn't like to share the data. They thought there was some kind of competitive advantage that they were giving up by doing so. And I think FSMA 204 is starting to break that paradigm, because it literally does say that you have to be able to trace products using the traceability lot code, lot, farm, parcel of land, produce or SKU, and even who picked it and what date, all the way through to consumption or to the receiver. So the UBQ network was really, was born as a concept saying, okay, if we're now willing to share data at a digital level between different stakeholders, and again, in the software or the digital services space, wouldn't it be great then to kind of bring all that data together and then make sure that we can build quality services on top of that? So the best way I can explain the UBQ network is probably something using like Expedia. So I think everyone has a good idea of what Expedia does. You've got different options. You can do hotels, you can do airline bookings, you can rent cars. There's other kind of niche services. And the UBQ platform was born to invite other software companies, other service providers, if you like, to connect, their digital data and build us together with us this digital marketplace. So that's really the concept. So, if you've got companies, the smaller producer grows, what do they struggle with? Well, probably, maybe cash flow, right? So factoring, we have factoring companies on the platform, or getting insurance, because it's usually, those larger companies that might get insurance, otherwise they self-insure. So we have Marsh providing our insurance. But the balance of that is, from that same digital data set is, the suppliers then get traceability forward and backwards in the food chain. And receivers then, they want to maybe link, the QA report that they have, but maybe direct the QA report to the actual shipments that maybe have some issues. And how do we find out there's issues? Because our temp recorders, report in real time that, this load has had a reefer damage or reefer malfunction. We're going to have to make some downstream changes in order to get that product to the stores as quickly as possible. Maybe we change the mix and allocation of stores, to something closer to shorten the time. Maybe we're going to have store sell-through programs. Maybe we change merchandising, put promotions in place to bring that produce closer to the consumer and quicker, so we don't get the food waste. And again, that kind of what we're trying to do then at UBQ is, bring all these service providers together on a common, if you like, data sharing or data backbone, so that we can start to solve these bigger industry problems.
That is a very valiant effort, and I love that you guys have taken up the mantle of kind of, because I haven't really heard of anyone trying to do anything like this. So I like that you guys have really come out and said, "Hey, we can all stay in our little like cubbies and go, hey, I'm gonna hold on to mine, but there is these new regulations coming out, and you do have to have that traceability, and it has to be like basically the manager at Wendy's has to be able to say, okay, I got my lettuce from this field picked by this guy on this date, and it has to be fully sortable. And personally, as a consumer, I love it. But when I first heard about it, I was like, this is going to be a nightmare, because there are a whole bunch of people within this supply chain that's getting this produce to the end users, whether it's a grocery store or a restaurant, whatever. There's a lot of people that do not have the infrastructure set up internally, like in their organizations, to handle this kind of extra reporting or this extra record keeping, because you obviously there's a lot of like smaller operations, mom and pop setups, or owner operators, they're not going to have a huge TMS that can accommodate all of this. And at the same time, you don't want to take them out of this industry because it's, especially in the produce world, it's once you're in, you're in. And like if you're reliable, nobody wants to get rid of you. So I'm very curious to see kind of as people start rolling this out and having all this kind of how it ends up shaking out. But it sounds like you guys have really picked up the mantle of like, hey, there are resources out here for you, and like, we're just one that'll help you find it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's certain reason why, again, why now. I think that the data or the standards is happening. So, you are getting to see some standards again from GS1, which is great. Obviously they've had the barcode for many, many years, but we're seeing the 2D barcode come in now as part of the new standard. So how we link then, an end-to-end transaction, which literally starts with a purchase order and ends, maybe, with a receiver QC report, you know, that's one part of the transaction. But if we extend that into the consumer realm and bring them in and then kind of educate them where produce is being made, proof of provenance, how it was handled through the supply chain, what's the carbon footprint, you know, the very fact that we're educating them about the quality of the produce also helps, educate them on this theme of food wastage. So bringing all the players together, and you're right, we have to have an inclusive ecosystem here. So, this is not some kind of play to lock people out. There's been attempts to do that. I think Food Trust from IBM might be a good one to discuss at some point in time. But we really want to invite, many organizations from the industry and also from the service providers to come to us to help kind of build this, if you like, this ecosystem together.
So when it came to, because obviously one of the big parts of this is, just to kind of go back to your Expedia analogy, it really is taking, everything from your Hilton hotels, your Marriotts to your Deltas, your Uniteds, and getting them all in one spot. Well, when you do that on the supply chain side, how were those early conversations? How did they go? Because it's like, "Hey, we want your information. We wanna create this great network, but we're not trying to price people out. We're trying to make it open to everybody. We're trying to make it really accessible." Was there a lot of resistance at the beginning of those, or was everyone pretty much, like, all in on the right off the bat?
Yeah, and there's no one answer to that. And I think, by the companies that we, basically, launch with, and we launched at the IFPA show in Atlanta in October this year. We're pretty the ones that, one bought into the vision. They're saying, okay, we could be a $10 billion company, we could be a startup, but we're buying into the vision because we realize that there's some bigger opportunities out there by working together. And that's really the first step. It's like working together by, digitization should drive down costs for everyone. Why do we do onboarding for 10 different service providers? IoT devices, QA reports, supply chain tracking, your ERP, EDI, every one of those requires an onboarding of some description. Why are we doing it 10 times when we can do it once and then share the data? So I think first it was like they bought into the vision. Then we get into the nuances of, okay, large companies, probably they have a lot more policies, a lot more, if you like, standards in place that would have to adapt to in order to make this work. So I'll give an example, the insurance side. You know, Probably the opportunity here is not so much on some of those larger companies. They've already got a policy, they're already working, but it'll be maybe some of those smaller organizations that you address that typically, they're self-insuring. So, part of the offering today on the insurance side is for those smaller producer growers that typically don't get access to insurance. Let's use the temperature data. Let's use, the platforms that already exist in order to basically create your quote. And basically by capturing another three key fields, you're going to get a quote for that particular shipment in 30 seconds or less. You can then take it or leave it. Again, we've seen this in many other maybe consumer industries. I mean, maybe you do this for car insurance. So we brought that same, if you like, simple concept to the world of produce to say, we know you need insurance. You're not going to need it on every single shipment. Maybe you don't need an annual policy with a high deductible, but here you can choose maybe the commodities, the customers, the trade lanes that you need, get a quote, and you still got the opportunity to choose it. Now, once they've got the certificate, obviously, the benefit is it's for that shipment. We know who moved it. We got the temperature data of how it was handled. We've got all the handling points. If there is an event, then we can share that data very quickly with the adjusters, and they can get to root cause and make payouts very quickly. So not only do we help the consumer, or the consumer experience, if you like, the customer experience on the purchasing side, but the most critical thing for anything in insurance, if there is some kind of insurance event, how quickly do I get my money back? And again, for these smaller companies, maybe the loss of one load, two loads could be catastrophic. So that's kind of, one example of insurance. Very similar maybe on the factoring. Again, what you see in factoring is there's maybe specific rules in place by country. So again, we tried to launch originally for the North American markets, Canada, US, Mexico. That's a very tightly integrated supply chain. But there's still nuances of how, if you like, factoring's done in the US versus Canada versus Mexico. And also the information that you need in order to create compliance by, in this case, whatever kind of financial jurisdiction that you're working under. So again, that due diligence process, again, we've tried to digitize as much as possible, and then, share any data sets that we have available in order to simplify and speed it up. Some other of the solutions are really a lot easier, right? So I'll talk to another one very quickly, which is carbon emissions. So, there's some, we might cover this a bit later, but carbon emissions, there's some laws already in place in Europe around it's called just have a look, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. There's something similar, obviously, in the US, specifically in California, SB 253. Large companies and their suppliers, now need to collect their carbon emission reports. The onus is on the large companies to actually do the reporting, but they're turning around and saying to their suppliers and their producer growers, okay, give me carbon emission reports. They call that scope 3 for everything that was shipped from Mexico, Michoacan to McAllen. And, people are scratching their heads, well, how do we do that, right? So luckily, we've got the journey data, again, with one of our temperature recorders, in real time. We then make sure we've got the actual distance. We know how the truck or which truck's being used. We can create a fairly accurate then carbon emission report using the data. So no Excels, going back to your point, no huge, high level assumptions, and no, capture errors. We're using data to simply do that process. And again, that's kind of real benefits for everyone in the whole ecosystem. The producer growers that probably didn't have the tech skills to actually do that themselves, or the priorities, the suppliers, but also the larger grocery chains and receivers, food service organizations, which are mandated by law to give proper carbon accounting.
I absolutely love that this is like just so encompassing and takes care of so many things, because it truly is helping everyone keep up with those latest regulations, getting all of those solutions. And I mean, even going back to the insurance that you can get as like a small carrier, like because sometimes, you'll get those loads where you're like, I should probably go get something for this specific load, just because, there are some stuff you haul that's extremely high value, or it's just a little atypical from what you usually haul. So that's where you're like, I kind of want a little extra security blanket there. But I just love that this is also accessible to everyone. And it truly is just kind of bringing everyone together to, more or less like hold hands and sing kumbaya. Maybe
Yep.
not kumbaya, but
Yeah.
there's probably going to be some hand holding around a campfire.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, hand holding, maybe, or handshakes would be a good way of describing the interaction or how the data flows between organizations, right? That's yeah, I can see that working quite well, the analogy.
All right. So that being said, we are running out of time a little bit today.
Yeah,
But Carl, there's a question that everyone comes on the show has to
yeah,
answer.
yeah.
It might be the hardest question that you have asked all day, and I know we went over some pretty tough ones earlier. And that is cereal considered a soup?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think you have to go back to what is a soup? And, a soup, typically, apart from one or two different, versions of it, like a gazpacho, is usually a warm, kind of a broth that's, has made with vegetables. Sometimes there's some protein in there. Um, you know, everyone's made some homemade soup at some shape or form, right? So, and it's usually warm. Cereal, unless it's porridge, is or some kind of thing, is usually going to be like, a colder kind of dish. So I'm going to lean on this one and say cereal is not a soup. At least in my kind of British understanding of like soups and cereals. So let's take out the outliers, but let's call a soup a soup.
I love it. I feel like the British are very qualified on soups, like, that you guys have that you guys have those on lock. But I'm also glad that you're on the correct side of this battle, because it's not they're two completely different things. They're in two
Yeah,
separate aisles of the grocery
yeah,
store.
yeah,
I can see the point that those that say it is. I can see that the point they make. It's just
yeah,
not the right one.
yeah, yeah. Agreed.
So if anyone wants to reach out about your cereal is soup opinions or kind of how this whole network works, or if they have any questions about it, where can they find you outside the show?
Yep, sure. So look for me on LinkedIn, carl.mcdermott on LinkedIn. My email is kmcdermott with double T at the end at deltatruck.com. And those are probably the two best ways to find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to the show. And I wish all your audience a happy festive season.
Thank you. You can catch other episodes of Running on Ice right here on FreightWaves TV, YouTube, or anywhere else you get your podcasts like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Need more Running on Ice news? No sweat. Subscribe to the newsletter on freightwaves.com/runningonIce. See you on the internet.